Hello everyone, and welcome to DE Classified, a podcast showcasing the history of destroyer escorts. Each month, a member of USS SLATER's education crew will highlight a specific destroyer escort and share the stories of the sailors who served aboard these trim but deadly ships. I'm Shanna Schuster, the Visitor Engagement and Program Manager at USS SLATER, and today, we're going to DE classify USS SLATER. The first episode of this podcast is going to set you up to understand the mission of destroyer escorts, why this new type of ship was built for World War II, and why these ships were built with different methods of propulsion. After we get the origins down, we'll move on to the history of USS SLATER. As I sit inside her supply office currently recording this episode, it's important to understand that this museum is meant to honor every destroyer escort and every sailor who served aboard one. We work daily to preserve their place in history. So let's dive in. So what is a DE? Well, it's a naval ship. Now, unless you're well seasoned in naval knowledge, many of you are probably picturing an aircraft carrier, like the Midway in San Diego, or a battleship, like the Arizona, the one that you see in all the Pearl Harbor footage. Those ships are so much bigger than a destroyer escort. Arizona is 600 feet long and 97 feet wide. She had a crew of over 1,000 sailors. Midway is 1,000 feet long, 238 feet wide, with a crew of 4,000 people. DEs are just over 300 feet long, 35 feet wide. They have a crew of about 200. So most battleships are twice the length of DEs, and aircraft carriers are more than 3 times the length. Destroyer escorts are just about the smallest ship that the Navy would allow out into the open ocean. Some people call them mini destroyers. That's not wrong, but having a close relationship with these ships, they are so much more than that. In appearances and armament, sure, think mini destroyer, but in spirit, they are a beast all their own. These tin cans, as they're affectionately called, were made as cheap and as quickly as possible with whatever materials were available at the time. Their outer hull is not armored and measures 5/8 of an inch thick. That's right, not even an inch of steel separates you from the cold waters of the North Atlantic while U-boats are hunting you. Destroyer escorts owe their origins to the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest sustained battle of World War II. This was a grueling 6-year struggle to keep the sea lanes between North America and Europe free of German submarines. England is an island nation, dependent upon ships to bring her food, fuel, and raw materials. When she stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940 and 41, it was the United States that committed itself to be the arsenal of democracy. The U.S. was determined to keep England supplied so she could fight on. Nazis used U-boats to sink ships heading to and from England carrying provisions. The convoys of ships sailing across the Atlantic in all seasons not only had to do battle with German submarines and aircraft, but they also had to contend with some of the worst weather known to mariners. Old destroyers, corvettes, and trawlers were used prior to the arrival of destroyer escorts in 1943. The Navy sent out a press release in December of 43, pulling no punches in its description of the conditions faced by the sailors who fought the U-boats. The release read in part, "On the destroyers, half the men watch and work while the other half sleeps. The guns are manned. The fires are lit under all the boilers. The cooks and bakers work to feed the men who are awake and hungry. Night is the same as day, for there is never any real sleep without the fear of the submarine or the pounding of your body against the bulk chains, or thinking of someone ashore, or being in pain, or waiting for the time to go on watch again, or praying, or wishing you'd get killed all of a sudden when it happened, watching the bursting of an ash can." The release continues. The lifeline to England, Russia, and Africa is a herd of rusty hulls, prodded along by battered destroyers. How do the hulls hold out after years of neglect, of oxidizing, stripping, and sagging? How can they go and return, and go again when their obsolescence is a waterfront joke? And even the insurance companies shake their heads. What of the United Nations when the seams split and the rivets shear and the shafts burn out? When the sea smashes the bulwarks and the hatches? When the oil is foul with salt water? When the coal is wet with the sea? How can they go on? Look to the men. Look to the men who can endure the wet and the cold and the sickness and the fear and the work with no rest. This statement summed up the weariness and fear that resulted from the seemingly endless struggle the convoys faced, battling U-boats and the Atlantic itself in old, worn-out ships. The destroyer escorts owe their existence to the desperate times created by the Nazi U-boat menace. In the dark days of 1940 and 41, when that island nation stood alone against fascism, the British Admiralty recognized the need for a small, maneuverable vessel to escort the convoys and protect the merchant ships and their valuable cargoes from U-boats. With their own shipyards too busy to design and build the required ships, they turned to America, the arsenal of democracy, for help. The end result was the destroyer escort. Many of the destroyer escort's design features came from British experience, gained from submarine engagements during 1939 through 41. They were the direct descendants of the British Hunt-class destroyers. The Hunt was an economically scaled-down destroyer that served successfully as a convoy escort. The British requested that 50 similar vessels be built under the Lend-Lease program. The American design firm of Gibbs and Cox was contracted to design the ships, which incorporated many of the British features. On January 20th, 1943, the first destroyer escort, USS Brennan, was commissioned. 562 sisters would follow her into service during World War II. The U.S. Navy was so impressed with the design and performance of these ships that only 78 ended up being transferred to England and France. The remainder served in the U.S. Navy throughout the war. Destroyer escorts, the small yet proud ships, honored the sailors that gave their lives protecting their nation. Smaller than the typical destroyer, each ship was manned by a crew of teenagers and commanded by officers only a few years older. At roughly half the displacement of a destroyer escorts carried a much smaller crew and armament. However, thanks to the mass civilian mobilization into the defense industry and their smaller size, DEs had a faster construction period of about 3.5 months, compared to the more than 6 months for a destroyer. USS Fieberling DE-640 was the fastest to be built and commissioned at 23.3 days. The rapid mass production of so many ships in such a short period of time was matched by the incredible feat of training the crews to man these ships. The DE crews were drawn from Navy and Coast Guard reservists. Most of the ships were placed in service with 95% of the crew never having been to sea before. They learned on the job and were united into efficient, smoothly operating units. The bond they formed with their ships has continued for the rest of their lives. DEs were built in shipyards all across America, and the shipbuilders used whatever surplus materials they had on hand. So some DEs get 5-inch guns, and some get 3-inch. Some classes have boilers, and some run on diesel. And the men that make up their crews, most are 17 or 18 years old. Some were younger and lied their way into enlistment. Most of them had never been to sea before. Most of them had never had indoor plumbing before. Let that sink in for a minute. For some of them growing up during the Great Depression, this might be the first time they've had indoor plumbing. This might be the first time they've been offered 3 meals a day. The officers of these ships were not much older. They had probably been to sea before, but never held command. Because DEs were such small ships, they went without many amenities that other ships were privy to. Lightheartedly, we like to point out ice cream machines as an example of this. Most Navy ships in the U.S. fleet had ice cream makers on board. It makes for a welcome treat in the heat of the Pacific. DEs did not have them, but there was one DE that did. And it just happened to be the one commanded by President Roosevelt's son, the USS Ulvert M. Moore, DE-442. I guess there's some perks to being the president's son. I'm sure he'd list ice cream at the top of that list. On a more serious note, DEs were not large enough to warrant their own trained doctor. We had pharmacist mates who had very little training at all. Slater crew member Earl Labor had this to share with us.
I remember I used to get very seasick, and I was in the engine room and I was laying down below the hatch to come down, and I heard things shifting around. I thought maybe I'd ought to get out of here, and I just stood up when a hail came down through and cutting my head open, and so I went to the sick bay. I remember him opening a book and taking a picture he had and starting to wrap my head up.
From the picture.
From the picture.
First aid by the book.
Yeah, that's right.
This was all the pharmacist mates could do. They followed directions out of the manual and did the best that they could. If an injury was more than they could handle, we had to either bring a more qualified doctor aboard from another, bigger ship, or get our patient transferred to that other ship. We've heard stories of pharmacist mates performing appendectomies while having an assistant read the procedure to them out of the book. The 563 destroyer escorts built during World War II were divided into 6 classes. 4 of the 6 classes mounted 3-inch 50 guns, while the last 2 mounted the larger 5-inch 38 guns. The various destroyer escort classes also mounted different types of propulsion, depending primarily upon what type of engine was available due to the high demands of new construction. The Everts class was the first type of destroyer escort to enter service in early 1943. These ships, commonly referred to as the short-haul destroyer escorts, were 290 feet long, 16 feet shorter than the other 5 DE classes. They mounted 3 3-inch 50 guns, a variety of anti-aircraft guns, depth charges, and a hedgehog for anti-submarine combat. The Everts class was the only destroyer escort type that did not carry torpedo tubes as built. In all, 97 Everts class DEs were built in American shipyards. 32 of these were given to the British Navy, while the rest remained in U.S. service. Although the Everts class proved the concept of the mass-produced destroyer escort, their relatively short range and poor seakeeping characteristics made them an unpopular design. Many of the shortcomings of the Everts class were rectified with the second class of destroyer escorts, the Buckley class. Buckley class featured a longer hull that improved seakeeping and increased range. These ships carried a similar armament to the Everts class, but they were the first destroyer escort type to carry torpedoes on board. Buckley's carried a turbo-electric propulsion plant, which gave it more speed and better range than the Everts. Numerically, Buckley class was by far the largest DE class. By the war's end, 154 Buckleys had been produced. 43 of these ships went to the British Navy. The Cannon class was the third destroyer escort type to enter service. This is one of the smallest classes produced during the war, with 72 completed by 1945, including USS SLATER. The Cannon class was very similar in design to the Buckleys, the primary difference being a diesel-electric power plant instead of the Buckley's turbo-electric design. The fuel-efficient diesel-electric plant greatly improved the range of the Cannon class, but at the cost of speed. 8 Cannon-class destroyer escorts were given to the Brazilian Navy during World War II, while 6 more were given to the Free French Navy. Except for the propulsion, the Edsel class was nearly identical to the Cannon class in every respect. This 4th class of DE mounted a direct drive diesel configuration that proved to be extremely reliable. 85 Edsels were built during World War II. 37 of the Edsel-class ships have the distinction of being the only DE class manned by U.S. Coast Guard personnel during the war. Many of the Edsel-class ships were converted after World War II into long-range radar picket ships. These ships are known as DERs and were some of the last DEs to be taken out of service in the late 1960s. The 5th destroyer escort class, the Rudder Row, represented a major departure from the original design. This was the first class to mount 5-inch 38 guns instead of the usual 3-inch 50s. Rudder Row class ships also featured a completely redesigned, much lower superstructure than that found on earlier DEs. 72 Rudder Row class DEs were built during 44 and 45. Most of these ships were converted into high-speed transports known as APDs. Only 21 of the Rudder Row class ended the war in their original configuration. The final class of destroyer escorts produced during the war was the John C. Butler class. These ships were outwardly identical to the Rudder Row class, but they mounted the steam-driven turbine propulsion plant that was common to most ships in the United States Navy at the time. Butler-class ships represented the peak of destroyer escort design. They combined many characteristics of the earlier classes with the weapons and propulsion plants that the other classes lacked due to limited American industrial capacity when the DE project began. 83 Butler-class ships were built during the war, and many of them remained active in the Navy long after World War II ended. In the post-war period, the Navy recognized that due to the massive Soviet submarine buildup, the need still existed for lower-end escort ships, such as the DE. With this in mind, the lower-end class of ships began with the Dealey-class single-screw DEs. Though built in relatively small numbers, the idea behind them was to be able to produce large numbers quickly should an emergency arise. These were followed by the diesel-powered and experimental Claude Jones class, soon to be followed by the more sophisticated Braunstein, Garcia, and Knox class, and then the Oliver Perry class frigates, which were increasingly larger and sophisticated but remained single-screw. The Knox and Perry class ships were built in a large number and served as the mainstay low-end escort vessel into the 1990s. In 1975, all DEs were reclassified as frigates to keep the U.S. Navy in line with NATO designations. Over 50 DEs were transferred to foreign navies under the Military Defense Assistant Program. These destroyer escorts served in the U.S. and Allied navies very effectively during World War II and continued to serve through the Cold War years, including active service during Korea and Vietnam. The last of these ships was retired from U.S. naval service in 1972. Meanwhile, a few sister ships soldiered on in diminishing numbers in foreign service into the 90s. As of 2019, 6 are known to exist worldwide. 2 in the United States, USS Slater and USS Stewart. USS Rushamkin DE-228/APD-89 is in Colombia. The USS Heminger DE-746 is in Thailand, still active in the Thai Royal Navy. USS McCann DE-179 is a museum ship in Brazil. And USS Atherton DE-169 is in the Philippines. Destroyer escorts were the modern warships that replaced the old destroyers and corvettes. They had borne the brunt of fighting since the war had begun. Rear Admiral Sheldon Kinney, who commanded several destroyer escorts, wrote of these new ships and their crews. The DE legacy is a story of an astonishingly able, mass-produced vessel that made a critical difference in the successful war at sea in World War II. Importantly, it is a story of the Navy and Coast Guard men who served in these ships. Men heroic in combat, long-suffering in endless watches, capable of enduring cruel seas, cold, heat, boredom, while waiting, watching, then suddenly rising to amazing capability in crisis. I want to finish this history of destroyer escorts with the words of famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle and his poem titled Short Cruise on a Destroyer Escort. They are rough and tumble little ships. Their afterdecks are laden with depth charges. They can turn in half the space of a destroyer. Their forward guns can seldom be used because waves are breaking over them. They roll and they plunge. They buck and they twist. They shudder and they fall through space. Their sailors say they should have both flight pay and sub pay both. They're in the air half the time and underwater half the time. Their men are accustomed to being wet and think nothing of it.